For my most recent project, I did research on the effects of raising the minimum wage. More specifically, the effects of a $15 federal minimum wage. On the surface level, most of the effects and perceptions seemed positive, raising almost 1 million people out of poverty, raising wages in general, all around increasing the power and influence of everyday workers. The $15 minimum wage was already being implemented in California and New York City, and in large companies like Amazon, where it saw very few negative effects. This seemed to be evidence that the $15 minimum wage was an overwhelmingly good idea. However, as I started to do more research, the biases in many of those lines of evidence came to light. The vast majority of conversations about the $15 minimum wage were centered in big cities like New York City or areas with incredibly high costs of living. A wage of $15 in some of those areas can be worth only half as much in real purchasing power as in some rural areas. This means that employers in rural areas, usually the American South, would be paying their workers effectively twice as much as those in big cities. That difference in real purchasing power leads to some very real issues. A $15 federal minimum wage is estimated to cause job loss of about 1.4 million Americans in the years after its implementation. Remember that less than 1 million Americans were estimated to be raised out of poverty by the same minimum wage. That means that more Americans would likely lose their jobs than be raised out of poverty. That is not to say that a $15 minimum wage shouldn't be implemented. New York City and California are evidence that it can work. The issue is just that it would do more harm than good if implemented on a federal level. Instead, we need to shift the focus away from a federal minimum wage. It is literally impossible to expect the federal government to be able to implement a one-size-fits-all minimum wage and expect it to be adequate despite the immense variances in the real cost of wages throughout the nation. The solution is to follow the examples of California and New York with localized wages. The way to have the best minimum wage for your state or city is to have the minimum wage implemented by that state or city. Some states, like Tennessee and Louisiana, have never created a local minimum wage in the state's entire history. Yet all of the blame for that is put on the federal government. My research was intended for people who live in those states and any of the other states or cities that refuse to raise their minimum wages, despite over a decade of inflation, in the hopes that they would hold their local governments responsible. The citizens of Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi, South Carolina, Tennessee, Georgia, Wyoming, Idaho, Indiana, Iowa, Kansas, Kentucky, New Hampshire, North Carolina, North Dakota, Oklahoma, Texas, Utah, and even Wisconsin, and thousands of other local municipalities could all benefit by pressuring their local governments to fix their minimum wages, which are all set at historic lows, if even set at all. If we as a nation want to avoid the detrimental impacts that a $15 federal minimum wage would bring to rural communities and small businesses, we need local and state governments to start playing their part in taking responsibility for the minimum wages themselves. Otherwise, the federal government will essentially be forced to fill that role and set a one-size-fits-all minimum wage that would be far too high for rural communities. My research seeks to avoid the job loss that would bring, while simultaneously providing the positive impacts that a higher local minimum wage would bring as well, like lowering poverty rates. That can only be done through local governments, however, and requires pressure from its local citizens. For more information on my research and conclusions, as well as more in-depth analysis on the problem and solutions, I created a full report on the matter. It is formatted as an opinion article because that is, well, largely what it is. Everything is heavily researched, but it is ultimately just my opinion. The opinion article is also a genre that I am very comfortable with and have been writing in for a while. I read a lot of them and write a lot of them, so it comes more naturally to me. I I hope you enjoyed this presentation of mine. Shout out to Nathan for making this an enjoyable class. Peace.